Hamjambo watoto wa Afrika. Yeah.
Welcome to I Lead Africa. Today we profile Allan Namu. Allan Namu is a local journalist with a global outlook.
I'm born and raised in Nairobi and Kiambu. Family of 5 kids, second last born. I had a fairly nice childhood, and I really can't complain about my upbringing. There's nothing to complain about. It was very nice. Grew up in Limuru, which is a lot better than Nairobi. And yeah, I mean, I went to school here. I basically know and have been born and bred to be a city boy with country roots.
He is famous for his investigative series that continue to feature a myriad of the stories embedded in the Kenyan society. Mr. Namu's various exposes have endeared him to the hearts of Kenyans as he courageously tackles difficult assignments that address corruption, drug dealing, and unearths the many ills in society that deserve to be surfaced and confronted.
My dad's interest in journalism, not as a practitioner, but just as a consumer, made me interested in journalism. My mom was a teacher, so she made me love the language. I think those are two things that help sort of define my path. And having grown up in a fairly, middle class, almost sheltered background, then the problems that the majority of the country faces become more and more apparent to you when they do happen, either to you or to someone that you know, or if you experience them just by seeing how everybody else lives. So that for me was a game changer.
He honed his talent and skills on KTN, Africa's first ever private television station, before joining the Nation Media Group. Mr. Namu is a recipient of a 2009 Presidential Commendation and the 2009 CNN African Journalist of the Year Award.
Having seen, some of the people that I have admired over history and the kind of strides that they've made, and reading about their own personal sacrifices and even their moments of defeat, then it tells you that one person can make a difference, and one team especially can make a difference. And especially if you're united in something that benefits very many people, then you should be able to make a difference. I don't know what the effect of my stories has been. I can only hope that it has brought some sort of change. I don't know for sure. I really hope that it does.
Having worked in investigative journalism for years, he broke off to follow the stories that matter to the country and the people. Africa Uncensored is an independent media house set up by Kenya's finest investigative journalists.
Each life is important, and everybody's story is important, especially the people who've been ignored. And people forget that those are the ones who change countries. You understand? So for Africa Uncensored, one of the focuses is, to cut a long story short, to start refocusing the lens on people and issues that are important to wider society's benefit, right? We can't grow as a society if we do not treat people as fairly as we can, Why is it that, and I think we've been conditioned as Kenyans and as Africans to think that there's a certain lot of people who deserve to be poor, there's a certain lot of people who deserve to be treated in a certain way, which is all nonsense, and why is it that we can't, all enjoy a certain standard of living that is dignified? It's all a construct of maybe our history, maybe even our leadership that teaches us that we're supposed to live in this way, and that's just that's how it is, and we should all take it and shut up. I don't believe that. I'll be honest enough to believe that, when I was younger, then maybe I thought that it's just the way it is, but it isn't, and it shouldn't be. So that's something that we at Africa Uncensored also believe in and commit ourselves to.
He shares his conviction that at the end of the day, you live and die by the stories you create, and that way they resonate with the public.
The dream was to be able to go out and tell really interesting African stories and, have people sit down and look at Timbuktu or some place in Nigeria, Chibitoke in Burundi, and say, hey, these guys live a very interesting life. It might be similar to me.
Media, especially in a country like Kenya, and at a time like this, has a very important role in representing the public.
And 20 years from now, I can sit down and replay this interview from wherever I am, either semi-retired or still going, and see Africa Uncensored as a brand that is recognized around the world for the quality that it has brought to Africa first, and also to the world, and the contribution that it's made to the world in terms of journalism.
Keep the fire burning, tell them the truth, there's nothing to lose, no. Keep the fire burning.
Welcome to iLead Africa. In here we raise the levels of leadership dialogues and engage with African leaders, business mavens, and the gurus of personal development. On this episode, we have the pleasure of hosting a man of many skills, but most of all, he is a journalist and a TV presenter. His name is John Allan Namu. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
To kick us off, talk to us about Africa Uncensored and what made you leave KTN to start such an outfit.
Well, I thought it was time, alongside some of my colleagues who founded this organization. We all thought it was time for us to be able to, not to harp on the cliche, but tell our own stories, but also tell them in an unrestricted and bold and balanced fashion, which we felt was not happening in the newsrooms in which we worked. We also feel that it's time that alternative sources of important information become part of the mainstream. So by that I mean, other journalists working outside of mainstream media houses can also contribute to the news agenda, can also contribute to the discussions and public agenda without having to be part of a newsroom. And that way it adds to the diversity of voices out there, but I also so that we can start to tell more African stories. I mean, go out there and let people know what Africa is about, and tell it as Africans,
Okay. It's a common lament among most African journalists and politicians and civil society activists that the biggest problem in Africa is that we do not tell our own stories, but rather we dwell so much on the Western capital. And the end result is that Africa continues to be defined by stereotypes. So how can the African continent liberate its freedom of expression?
Well, simply by taking the time to see the importance of the stories of African people as being as important as stories from anywhere else in the world. The analogy is made about the Charlie Hebdo attacks happening at the same time as terrorist attacks in northern Nigeria, and which got more coverage. Well, rather than focus on the Charlie Hebdo attacks, and I know because a lot of media is focused on the West, rather than focus on them, there are things that happen closer to home that perhaps would be of more significance, and it's important for us to just start to acknowledge that. I think it's time for us to admit that to ourselves and say, look, we're important too, and this isn't an ideological point that I'm making. It's really just reality. Yeah, the realities that you go through on a daily basis are no less significant than the ones of a young lady, in New York, or in somewhere in Canada, or somewhere in Europe. They're the same. So why not characterize them in the same way and put the same weight on them?
True. The ethical and professional standards of journalism should be designed by practitioners and not political leaders or rather politicians. This is because they do not really know what media ethics is. Do you think journalists are adequately involved in the whole thing?
Well, yes and no. I mean, journalists have an internal understanding based on the fact that they are professionals, and they understand where the shoe pinches, so to speak. But having said that, I wouldn't say that politicians or other actors in society shouldn't have a voice in the direction that journalism takes in terms of the ethics, because we report about everybody. We report about politicians, we report about civil society activists, we report about ourselves, the good, the bad, the ugly, right? So having a discussion that includes the voices and the opinions of politicians is not necessarily a bad thing. Having them dictate what from their point of view and their narrow experience should be the laws that govern a body that they have no understanding of course, I completely disagree with that. But having them contribute their voices and have more of a dialogue around what they think are the areas that we go wrong or can succeed in isn't necessarily a bad thing.
Okay. As a country, we are very much politically driven, and there's a big shift towards issue-driven stories.
Yeah.
Alan, do you think that we have deliberately focused on issue-based stories?
By issue-based, you mean things that are actually based on the real challenges that people go. Actually, I think that we haven't. I think that there's not a great dearth of stories that are issue-driven in Kenya. That's because perhaps, I don't know if we created a monster or we found a monster there. Politics and political discourse is a very important part of our country, and that's not to say that we should completely ignore it. Politics is an important part of any country's discourse, and it shapes the future of a country anywhere you go in the world. So we shouldn't ignore that. But having said that, there's this affair that we have with politics in our country that becomes almost inane. So when a politician says something, then it gets more weight than the actual issue that is driving what he is saying. So news and current affairs reporting becomes about what the politicians say, about the sound bites, rather than the issues. I'll give you an example. With the IEBC debate, there actually are very important issues to be discussed there. But what have we been treated to for quite a bit of the period of its coverage? Moses Kuria said this versus Raila said that. Jubilee said this versus CORD said that. It's a battle of sound bites, not a competition of issues, right? Maybe we're hoping for too much, but I think we can raise that plane as journalists, and I think that's what we ought to do.
Okay.
Yeah.
The government has reiterated that it will continue promoting a free environment for journalists through policy intervention. This is because it considers the media a great partner, a very important partner in their development, in driving its development agenda.
Yep.
What are some of the policy inventions that you would suggest, or rather you would look forward to?
I think legislation in this country, to disagree slightly with you, is being used for the exact opposite objective than what is being stated by government. It's being used to over-legislate, it's being used to threaten and to scare journalists into reporting and towing certain specific lines, which isn't fair, right? We should be given the environment, or rather not given, we should fight for the environment that we want and we deserve, but we should also nurture it. So in that respect, journalists have a responsibility to report responsibly. In that way, when the president says that, he's not very wrong, but the motives behind him saying that sometimes, the motives behind senior politicians saying these things sometimes, is so that we do not report on the things that actually are important. So by having politicians say that policy is going to help improve this country's reporting, they have to come at it from a very honest perspective and altruistic perspective, and say that yes, if we are going to legislate, we must carry you along with us and help create a legislation that works for everybody, not just for us.
Okay. Editorial and journalistic freedom is essential for the agenda-setting role of the media. This presupposes that the media have the editorial capacity and leadership to set such an agenda. Does the Kenyan and African media effectively execute on its agenda-setting role?
I don't think any media, whether American or European or African for that matter, does that 100%. A great example is the American media's coverage of Donald Trump. I mean, it's fairly subjective, based on, not subjective, it's based on ratings by and large. He has this big character who is running for an election, and it's such an obscene story almost that we have to cover it on a daily basis, even if the fact of the matter is that that man should not be anywhere near a presidential podium, let alone the White House, right? So those are problems that America deals with. But in Africa, we have the same. We've spoken about the romance that we have with politics. We've spoken about the fact that in many African countries, free and independent journalism is taboo, right? So I wouldn't say that our problems are worse than others. Perhaps when it comes to threats, intimidation, and the kind of environment that we work in, then you can have some sort of metric to compare. But everywhere we have problems. Now, if we look at how those problems impact our fulfilling of our editorial mandates, then yes, there's that. But I'd say there's also self-created or self-inflicted problems where media houses, by virtue of the fact that they're also searching for commercial sort of like bottom line to some of the things that they're doing, abandon certain tenets of journalism and look for ratings and look for things that are quick wins and easy fixes. Those are words that you'll hear in newsrooms bandied about many times. And that affects the quality of our reporting.
So according to you, Allan, do you think that the editorial independence is protected against government pressures, media owners, and advertisers?
Legally, right now, we have a framework that says that we are free, but the reality is often different. All of the players that you stated have some influence on editorial independence in this country, be it commercial, be it government. Those two are often the ones that you hear about. But also, for some reason, that journalists' own ambitions sort of like help, in some ways, help build that narrative. So a journalist, wants to be rich, and so they play into a certain, politicians' hands, certain private institutions' hands as a business reporter, certain sports foundations' hands as a sports reporter, and they spoil the pie for themselves, right? But those overarching interests are always there, and they're always going to be there. Are we as a media creating individuals first and then institutions within media houses that help us stand up to these kinds of things? So where a journalist can come and say no to a certain story that's being pitched by a big telecom or something like that in our country, or a parastatal for that matter, the implication is not one that affects the bottom line and thus their salary. And if that threat is made, then the media should band together and expose those kinds of threats. So in a sense, yes, those pressures are there and they will always be there, and let nobody cheat you. But it is how we respond to them that now becomes, the true test of who we are.
True. Hold it right there. Let's go on break. We are taking a break. We'll be right back.
Keep the fire burning. Tell them the truth. There's nothing to lose. No, keep the fire burning.
Welcome back to the show. This is iLead Africa, and I am with John Allan Namu. And in case you just joined us, we are discussing editorial independence and journalistic freedom. Allan, do you think that journalism training institutions offer the students with the skills for exercising freedom with boldness and innovation and facing the hostile media society in Kenya?
Wow, that's well, I really don't know what they're offering now. What they were offering when I was in school, I'd say, was theoretical, helpful, but theoretical, and for a different time. But what I've seen from my time in a newsroom is that many journalists aren't prepared for the kind of environment that meets them. But you know, there's a saying that goes, or rather a story that goes, a professor tells his class that half of the stuff that I'm going to teach you is wrong, and the other half, I don't know whether it'll work. I just don't know which half I'm teaching you. So you get the analogy. It's a problem of all professions that you don't really know what the changing environment is going to be able to bring. But having said that, having seen some of the curriculum that journalists in training are being exposed to, I'd say that there are certain things that aren't being taught. Although I have to say that there are some institutions that are doing some really good work around exposing the journalists early to the practical environment of journalism, which is so important for a profession like ours. At Africa Uncensored, we have an early career training program that helps people who have a desire to become investigative journalists sort of hone their skills early in their careers based on our practical experience and their own experience within that program. So I'd say more practical work is the solution to fixing the question that you just asked.
Okay. In virtually all African countries, a fundamental problem in the self-serving political leadership that places its own enrichment and the enrichment of their friends above the national welfare. Has the media been able to bring the political leadership to a sense of responsibility?
Well, they've tried. In this regard, you know, media critics would say not enough. But look at the newspapers when it comes to reporting around corruption. There have been quite a number of stories, including today's paper, that are carried around the issue of corruption, the issue of poor leadership in Kenya and in Africa. Well, certainly more needs to be done, but remember the people that you're dealing with are the people who hold the keys to the state, in a sense. So the keys to the kingdom. So it's very difficult to do that in an environment where journalists aren't protected and aren't respected in some countries. So it's a factor of quite a number of things. It also takes a bit more support from not just the newsrooms, but from society at large to make journalists feel protected when they do these kinds of things.
The African media are too controlled by partisan ethnic, business, regional, religious, or class interests to build consensus on action that will benefit people of all backgrounds. How can we rise above such narrow perspectives? What must we do?
Well, we have to acknowledge those biases exist in the first place. To talk in a bar and say that Kenya is a tribalist society and then not expect that to be reflected in your media is a bit ridiculous, right? So we have to, as a country, come to a time or come to a point where we can discuss these things openly, discuss our tribal biases, discuss our cultural biases, discuss them being the key, not fight over them. And the media can be a huge partner in doing this by having no holds barred but ethical and, well, that's a bit of an oxymoron, by having difficult discussions, by having hard-hitting discussions that are tethered to the law but still confront these issues. So in that regard, the social contracts that we have with one another are not really something that media in Africa discusses because, like I said, there are certain things in a hierarchy of things that the media north in Africa thinks is important. So politics, business, sport, social contracts between the rich and the poor, the have and the have-nots, people of different tribes and ethnicities. Those become secondary conversations until they become problems. So it also takes changing your focus and changing your perspective and saying what things are important. But then you also have to acknowledge that the news cycle is not one that's going to wait for you to discuss tribe when, you know, there's some sexy thing that's happening on the road. You understand? That's also the nature of the beast. So we have to, you know, try and find our own way of doing these things.
One of the problems is lack of public knowledge on media freedom and its guarantors. Who are the major actors in maintaining a free and responsible media system?
Everybody benefits when the media is free. You do, I do, the person in Lokichara does, the person in Burundi does, the person in Cape Town does. Everybody is a stakeholder and therefore an interested party when it comes to the freedom and independence of the media. So there isn't one person or one institution that has a monopoly of deciding who is free, who gets to be free, and who doesn't. And that's something that will come to be understood over time in certain environments. In Kenya, go and ask, by and large, go and ask people what, you know, whether the media should be free and independent, and you'll get some answers where people will tell you no, that they're irresponsible and blah, blah, blah. But ask them about an issue that's important to them and how they found out about it or how they'd want it dealt with. 9 times out of 10, you'll hear the media included in that statement. So in that way, they are a stakeholder, and therefore they value, in spite of themselves, the importance of the media. It's just being able to frame it and acknowledge it in a certain way so that people sort of like know that that's what they're talking about. I don't think it's for a lack of knowledge. Just maybe a lack of understanding of that knowledge.
Okay. And Allan, as you wind up, what are your thoughts on bringing about competent, responsible, and media-free society in Kenya?
Well, I have many thoughts. Let me try and restrict them to a few minutes. Well, first of all, the initiative that we have here is an action based on thoughts that myself and my partners had about free and independent media. Do it yourself. You know, if it doesn't work where you are, make it work where it can. And Africa Uncensored is a response to that. Every member of this team has a responsibility and a role to engender free and independent media, not just here but in Africa, and they understand that. They're a group of very talented individuals.